Hello, welcome back to Around the Museum with Joe and Diane as we have moved on and we are properly walking around the museum now. And we've actually got a brand new exhibit since last time, exhibition, which we dealt with living fossils, which is what we'll be discussing in this episode. We dealt with living fossils on the last series, but we kind of just, had them kind of pulled out and, we'd only just started.
It was a bit random.
Well, we've actually ended up developing a museum trail, and this is a plan which we want to do throughout all the museum, and hopefully while you're here, Diane, or in the next couple of visits that you come, we'll be able to film some more with you and do some more of these trails. But we want this to be a hands-on museum. We want it to be a museum, a place where you come to think. And we want it to be a place where you can come and have your own tour around. And so we're using some great new technology like QR codes and smart devices and stuff where basically people will be able to come and scan part of the trail, and we'll be able to follow it around the museum. And we actually have that kind of laid out here, and it takes people through the story of living fossils, because it is a fascinating thing. So Diane, what is a living fossil?
Well, a living fossil is a creature whose fossils are exactly the same as the living beings that we see in the world today. So you can pick up the fossil, look at the living thing, and the first thing that's really obvious is that they're the same.
And of course, this makes a great exhibition because you can have the fossils and the living things together, and it's a very visual thing, right? And now we do see some examples of change in the fossil record, and we'll actually talk about that probably in the next episode, and we'll get into a little bit deeper into some of the changes we do see. But even in the things which we do see change in, like ginkgos, even secular scientists admit that they're still a living fossil. It's still a ginkgo. In fact, we've got a book here, which is quite a famous book or infamous book, depending on your point of view, on the origin of species, which of course is not the full title. Do we know the full title?
It's, on the origin of species by natural selection.
Means of natural selection, or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. So now, I know you've pointed out several times, Diane, that title doesn't even make sense.
No, it's not even a good piece of English, let alone good science.
There we are. Anyway, there's an interesting quote in here because the term living fossils was actually coined by Charles Darwin.
Yes, that's one of the ironies of it.
And he was actually talking, he has a whole chapter on his book dedicated to some of the problems with his theory and some of the imperfections of the geological record. And he makes this point because, you see, Darwin was trained by a man called Charles Lyell, who was a lawyer by trade, but became a natural theologian or a natural scientist. That's what they were called back then, the natural philosophers, who studied rocks and published a 2-volume book on the principles of geology. And Darwin took the book with him on the Beagle, which is what gave him the inspiration to write On the Origin of Species. And even he claimed that, most of my ideas come out of Lyell's brain, and he's never given enough credit for it. But Charles Darwin certainly knew the rocks. He knew the geology, and he knew that you found these fossils which were identical to their modern day counterparts, and he actually said that these should be anomalous forms. He said these anomalous forms, they seem to have endured to the present day. They could almost be called the living fossils. So he viewed these as they ought to be anomalies. They shouldn't be the norm, but are they anomalies?
No, they're not. In fact, they are the norm. Darwin thought they were anomalies because he was so wedded to his theory that his theory was that things have changed, and yet there he was confronted with things that obviously hadn't changed. And so he called them anomalies because, as far as he was concerned, his theory was what explained the world.
Yeah. Now, if we have anybody who disputes the idea of his theory being about change, we actually went to Shrewsbury yesterday, or Shrewsbury.
Yes, we did.
And we saw Darwin's statue outside the school that he attended because it's his birthplace, and they do really capitalise on the association with Darwin. Because what was the first thing we came across as we came over the bridge and we stopped? There was a little shop there. What was that called?
It was a coffee shop, and it was called Evolution Coffee.
So there you go. You could. I mean, we said, didn't we? We wouldn't buy any because you don't know what it'll evolve into by the time it's reached our lips.
Right.
But It had an interesting quote on the side. We took a photo of it. It had an interesting quote on the side. It was actually, again, one of Darwin's quotes, and it was one of Darwin's quotes about his theory. And the quote was, he said that my theory is not dependent on the creature that is the strongest or the most intelligent, but it's the one that is most likely or most adaptable to change.
Yes.
In other words, his entire theory of evolution is a theory around change.
Yes.
It's a theory about change. It's a theory that requires change. And yet he admitted, even 150 to 200 years ago, that the fossils really don't show change. They show living fossils, creatures reproducing after their own kind. And he said they ought to be anomalies, but we have a display here of living fossils, so perhaps we should go down, Diane, and have a look at some of these anomalies. Perhaps they're not quite such anomalies after all. What's this first one down here, Diane?
Well, here we have a crocodile. And it just looks like a crocodile that lives in the rivers of the Northern Territory in Australia.
I was going to say, that's your neck of the woods. Well, not quite the Northern Territory, but it's more your neck of the woods than mine anyway.
Yes, that's right. We have more crocodiles here in Australia than we do in England.
So it's an example then of a living fossil, because this is a crocodile which is supposed to be around the 68 million year age. And you'll actually notice on our little plaques that we have in this exhibition, you'll see that you've actually got the name, that's its modern name there, crocodile. We'll try and put the Latin name in as well if it is, where it comes from, the type of rock that it comes from, so the Cretaceous rocks in Morocco. And then we've got, you can see here on the supposed age, 68 million years. Now we put that in not because we believe they're 68 million years old, but we're trying to make a point here.
Yes, that it doesn't matter how old you want to make them, they're still the same. So you can put an old age or a young age, but those are the ages which are published in the general literature.
But it's making the point that even by secular dates, 68 million years is quite a long while, but we've got some fossils here that go to 2.5 billion years old, supposedly, and they're still alive today. So we'll talk about those as we come along. But let's make a move on down, because this is perhaps, Diane, the most classic and one of the most beautiful of all the living fossils, the Nautilus here. What can you tell us about the Nautilus?
Well, this is a sea creature that swims around in the sea. It's a shellfish, and we have its shells here. They are particularly beautiful. They're wonderful evidence for design. And a little creature that's a bit like a miniature octopus lives in the last part of the shell there. And they're brilliantly designed. One of the things they can do is move up and down in the water column in the same way that a submarine does by outgassing.
So let's just pull one out so you can see, because this is the modern Nautilus shell, which we've cut in half. And so those are the chambers which the gas in there you're talking about. Yes, you can see
the individual chambers. The little creature will live here. And it will regularly make a new one of these chambers. So that's how it grows. So it starts out being very, very small, and it grows in this particularly beautiful spiral. And they're wonderful examples of living fossils because we have their shells preserved. We can observe them. I've actually seen one. It was in an aquarium. It wasn't out in the sea. But then we have these beautiful fossils, and you can see they're exactly the same.
And so 120 million years in this case, these are supposed to be Cretaceous, 120 million years and really no evolution at all. And it's the same for everything in this cabinet. We've got our razorfish, which is, again, you just can compare it to the modern one. There's no change at all. And this is the kind of really visualization, particularly with this, because this is a pipefish. But if you look at it, you can see you've got your fossil example right next to our modern example, which is actually the common pipefish. We found that in Norfolk. So it's from British seawaters. It's about the closest that we get to seahorses in this country.
Yes, that's right.
But 12 million years for the fossil. There's the modern one next to it. And bear in mind, humans were supposed to have gone from ape-like creatures to human beings in about 2.5 million years. And 12 million years doesn't sound as big as 120 million years, and it's not. but it's still a huge amount of chance for change according to evolution, because we're supposed to have evolved from ape-like creatures in 2.5 million years, but 12 million years, and pipefish are still
Yes,
pipefish.
and it's a much simpler sort of creature. But there, I mean, we couldn't have made that up with
it's
the
ideal,
real
isn't
one
it?
and the
It's
fossil
just
one.
perfect. But what do we find? Because we have museums like this all over the world, right? We have our museum in Australia, here in the UK, Tasmania, USA, Canada. And you try and do examples like this, which get people to ask questions and hands-on. What's our response like to people when they can come up and actually see this in front of them, both the living and the fossil creature, side by side?
Well, the first thing you can say about it, it obviously hasn't evolved. Right? The other more positive thing you can say about it is, well, in the Bible, it says that God made things according to their kind. And here we have evidence that they have multiplied after their kind. And the longer you want to make them for their age, the older you want to make the age, the more they've multiplied after their kind. Now, we know the lifespan of some of these creatures. Some of them have long lifespans, some of them have short. So however many generations you want to put in there, they have multiplied after their kind. So they are really good, positive evidence that the scriptures are true.
And if God says something once, you ought to pay attention. If God says something 10 times in one chapter, a relatively short chapter, he's really trying to drive the point home. And it really, 10 times Genesis chapter 1, it states that God created all living things to reproduce after their own kind. So it's really a vital point that we're trying to get in. But let's dig a little bit deeper into this concept of kind, Diane, because it's not a term that we often recognise as being a scientific term, but it really is a scientific term at its heart, because it relates directly to our modern classification system. So who used the term kind in our modern classification system?
Well, the man who invented the system that we basically use now, Carolus Linnaeus, that was the Latinised version of his name. He was a Swedish man whose name was actually Carl von Linné. But he recognised that the word in Genesis was genus, the one that is translated as kind. Now, he was reading an older version of the Bible, and he was a very learned man, so he would have known Latin and Greek. And the New Testament was written in Greek, and the Old Testament had been translated into Greek. So he recognised this Greek word, genus or genera for the plural, and that was translated as kind in our modern English Bibles. But he went back to the original Greek. That is what God originally created. They were generated, right, or genus, when God spoke, and they have remained after their kind, after their original generation or after their original creation ever since.
And so Carl Linnaeus or Carl von Linné, he produced this binomial system, two-naming system, right, where you have genus and species. And so he was going, well, God clearly created according to its kind, that kind being, that word kind being the word genus in his Greek and Latin Bibles. So he says, well, we'll start with that as the overarching, a classification for our animals, this binomial two-naming system. But it's clear that you get diversity within that kind.
Yes.
A dog is a classic example of that. Everything from the giant XL American bullies that have just been banned in this country all the way down to your little Chihuahua, right? And not only are they the same kind as each other, they're the same species as each other, and they're the same species as the American grey wolf, right? Canis lupus. And so he said there's clearly variations, so you can get a special variation of that kind. And so he had kind as his first name, then a special variation as his second name. That's where we get genus and species from. Genus from the old Greek word meaning kind, as it is translated in our English Bibles, and species from the special type of that kind. And so really this this classification system, our modern scientific classification system, is actually based directly on Scripture.
Yes, indeed.
As is most of our science, because most of these scientists were Christian who actually did this work and research. So it relates in really, really nicely. So when we're dealing with living fossils, we're dealing with kinds that have stayed the same, because that's what God said. He said they reproduce after their own kind. So yes, we can have little nuances and differences. So there would be some who would say, oh yes, but this is a nautilus, but it's a different species from the modern one. Well, that doesn't make any difference at all, does it?
No, it doesn't. It's still clearly a nautilus. And so you get variation within kind, and wonderful variation. But then when God is creative and artistic, you expect to see variation. You don't expect to see everything that's exactly the same as if it was made in a factory.
No, and you do expect there to be, as the nature of life and the nature of genetics, there to be a variation within those created creatures, because that's part of his beauty and his design, but they still only reproduce according to their kind. So that's the evidence that we see in the fossil record. And of course, it's not just living fossils that we can get evidence against evolution for, because of course, as we mentioned, Charles Lyell, he said that Charles Darwin said most of his ideas were based off Charles Lyell's ideas. And Charles Lyell, while he wasn't too much into the biology side of things, what he really promoted was this idea of millions of years, deep time, uniformitarianism, right? This is the geological background. And so Charles Darwin said, well, you know, the argument was, if the world is millions of years old, the Bible can't be true, so we need a new way to actually produce all of life and give an origin of all life. And so you have Charles Lyell giving the millions of years, Charles Darwin coming in and giving the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. So Lyell gets rid of the Bible, Darwin replaces it, or provides a means as to get life without using scripture. So the millions of years is an important part of this, because no matter how old you try and make it, these creatures haven't changed. So when we come down to something like this, Diane, right down at the bottom there, you can see we've got our fossil jellyfish. So number one, it's a living fossil, yes?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, number two, it's supposed to be 500 million years old, because these are the bottommost layers, the Cambrian layers, right, the Cambrian layers. So in 500 million years, there's been no evolution.
Not of jellyfish, no.
So there's a good piece of evidence against evolution, because if you've been 500 million years and you haven't evolved, then you're not likely to evolve anytime soon.
No.
But what else can this jellyfish tell us about how it was buried and how it was fossilized?
Well, it had to be buried rapidly, because I can remember my brother and I used to go to the beach when we were young, and we hated jellyfish. And they would get washed up by the waves, and we would make sure that they didn't go back into the sea, because we hated them. And we would deliberately push them up on the beach, and you could almost watch them sort of fizzle up.
And just dry out.
Come back the next day, and there's nothing much left of them. So in order to preserve enough detail to be identified as a jellyfish, and you can actually see the details of their internal structure, they have to be buried rapidly. You cannot slowly and gradually fossilize a jellyfish. It will have just disappeared into sort of goo.
So it's a good piece of evidence then again that those millions of years just aren't simply viable.
They're not there in the rocks.
So you can't see them. So again, from both the living fossils as well as from the rapid fossilization. All right, well, as you can see, there's so many different examples of living fossils. One of my favourite one is the sunfish here. You can see it next to the modern the fossil example. But Diane, let's just talk about just one particular one. Going a little bit deeper, let's talk about the coelacanth.
Yes.
Right, so here's our model of the modern coelacanth. We've got a couple of fossil examples in there, and we've actually got some examples of coelacanth fins as well, these sort of short, stumpy kind of fins here. So, okay, tell us a little bit about the coelacanth, because for many years it was only known from the fossil record.
Yes, it was thought to be extinct. And the standard story was, well, it went extinct because it evolved into a land creature. And the reason they thought of that, it does have these stubby, fleshy fins, and so they looked like they were the beginnings of legs starting to form.
So we've got these, they match up obviously to the fossil ones that we've got. They've got these weird sort of looking fins, stumpy kind of looking things. And so you're saying that they said, well, look, this is clearly a creature that is on its way to evolving into a tetrapod, into something that would then crawl out on the land, amphibian-like creature, half and half. Okay, so it was known from the fossils, went extinct supposedly, if I remember correctly, in the Triassic. So we're talking at about sort of 220 odd million years ago or so. And so that was all well and good. We only knew it from the fossils, and we assumed that the fins were on their way to evolving into legs. So what's the next part of the story?
Well, the next part of the story, it was found to be alive.
In a fisherman's net out of South Africa, I believe.
Fisherman's net actually found one off the coast of South Africa around the Madagascar area. They've since been found in Indonesia and various other parts of around the Indian Ocean there. And yes, it's alive and well and living at the bottom of the sea, not on any coastlines. And that's why they were so rare, because it's a deep sea fish.
It's a deep sea fish. So what you're saying then is that being a deep sea fish, it's nowhere near to evolving legs to go onto the land. It's about as far away from the land as it can get.
That's right.
Yes. And so what does it use these stumpy fins for?
And well, because it lives right at the very bottom of the sea, it can actually use them to sort of squish around at the bottom of the seabed to find food. And that's a useful function for a fish that lives right deep
at the bottom of the sea, right? So it's not as way to doing legs or anything at all. There we go. So it's a deep sea fish, and it is just a deep sea fish, but it's a living fossil.
It's a living fossil,
and it hasn't evolved.
Yes, that was the surprising thing when they found them. It was instantly recognised because we knew the fossils.
Yeah, and that's the point. There's people who will argue today that, the modern ones are a slightly different species, or, the modern ones are not, exactly identical in every way. But then you get variations even within modern coelacanths. You get variations within modern creatures. So we'd expect to find some minor variations between the fossils and the modern ones. But the fact that you can look at them and go, they are clearly the same kind, shows you that they haven't evolved from anything, and they haven't evolved into anything. And I think is the real big key, because you find these creatures fully formed in the fossil record, and they don't evolve into anything. So they've come from nowhere, they've evolved into nothing, they have just done what?
They've multiplied after their kind.
Great stuff. Well, Diane, let's come down here and talk about one more aspect of living fossils before we carry on. So if we come down to this table down here, because I want you to talk about these, because these are an Australian creature, or an Australian phenomenon,
Life form, yes.
Life form. Now, we have examples here from all over the world. We've got some of the 500 million year old ones, supposedly, of course. We don't agree with these dates, as we said earlier. We're just making the point. These are supposed to be 500 million years old from Africa, more ones from Africa. These are some from the UK, Triassic, 250 million years old, a Scottish one, 300 million years old, 150 million from Germany. And this one down here is supposed to be 2.5 billion years old. That's 2,500 million.
Yes.
So what are these creatures, organism, things?
Well, these are stromatolites, and the beautiful striations you get there is that they're layers. They're layers of living creatures, but they're quite weird living creatures. They literally fossilise themselves. they're algae, so like seaweed, but only single cell. And they actually secrete minerals around them, so they build themselves up in layers. And the really interesting thing is that we can actually watch that process happening, because these are the ultimate living fossil. They are alive and well and living off the coast of Western Australia.
And there's no change whatsoever in them at all.
No, the ones that are living off the coast of Western Australia look exactly the same as the ones that you dig up in the fossil record.
So, excellent evidence that even according to evolution, some of the oldest forms of life, some of the things that were first ever supposed to have evolved on this planet, just simply hasn't changed. They've just reproduced after their kind. And that tells us something as well about the DNA, about the genetics, because we often say in creation research that we are designed, living things are designed to not evolve. So what are we talking about when it comes to this self-checking mechanism that DNA has to make sure that we don't change?
Well, DNA has a lot of self-repair and self-editing processes where whenever it is reproduced, in other words, when a cell divides, it all has to be copied. And during that process, it is constantly checked to see that the copy is accurate. But even within the normal cell cycle, there is constant surveillance of our DNA, and if a damaged piece is found, there are mechanisms for taking that out and replacing it with a new piece that is accurate. So DNA is designed not to evolve, it's designed to repair itself. Sometimes the repair processes break down and you will get change, but all that will do is degenerate it. It will damage it. It will lose information. It will not turn it into some new kind of creature, and certainly not into a more complex creature with more information. All it will do is damage it.
And of course, the real point that we're making here is evolution is supposed to be driven by mutations, which are then selected for and against by natural selection. And of course, natural selection doesn't explain anything. It's just selecting from pre-existing things. But it's mutations that are supposed to be the driving force of evolution. And yet what we're dealing with in all living stuff is DNA, which has a mechanism to stop itself from mutating. In other words, the very driving force of evolution doesn't exist because we're designed to not mutate. We're designed to not change. And as you say, that can break down. There can be problems. We can degenerate. We're both wearing glasses. Right? This is part of the problem, right? But ultimately, we are designed to not evolve. But just to round things up, because we've got a whole load more living fossils we need to go through, and we'll do that in the next episode and talk a little bit about some of the change that we do see in the fossil record. But I just want to show you the arbitrary nature of these dates, because we've gone through all these dates, right, from 2.5 billion years all the way just to a few million years. But I just want to show you some of the arbitrary. This is a stromatolite from South America. It's a beautiful, beautiful example. Amazing striations, gorgeous kind of gold colour almost. Well, this, there was a huge one of these on display in the Houston Museum of Natural Science. I went there just a few months ago, and it was dated at 3.7 billion years old. Supposedly the oldest ever life to have ever been found. Amazing stuff, really. The problem is that the Houston Museum of Natural Science had it a bit out of date because this was reclassified by scientists just a couple of years ago. And they reclassified it from 3.7 billion years, that's 3,700 million years, down to just 70 million years.
That's an awful lot of time to suddenly mislay.
It also shows you how little they've changed, because it doesn't matter whether you make it 3.7 billion or 70 million years. The reality is creatures reproduce after their own kind. And what was it based on? Just an arbitrary piece of data that they found, and they decided to change it, and it's still hotly debated over. And how you can debate over whether something is 3.7 billion or just 70 million years, it just shows you how arbitrary some of these dates are and how much it relies on just interpretation and an understanding of the rocks as opposed to actual empirical evidence. But there we go. Anyway, it's time to move on, Diane. We'll see you for our next episode as we look more into living fossils. Be sure to check out creationresearch.net, and we will see you next time. Check out Creation Research Live, our all-new streaming service for creation research, with thousands of free resources and access to all of Creation Research's premium documentaries, debates and presentations through a low-cost monthly subscription. Find out more at creationresearch.live. Got questions? We've got answers. Check out askjohnmackay.com to see Q&A articles by experts from around the world. See also the creationfactfile.com website for latest evidence news from creation research. Be sure to join us for Creation Conversations, a weekly live broadcast with the whole creation research team dealing with different topics from creation, evolution and the Bible. Watch Creation Research TV, a live 24/7 broadcast of everything creation research, available for free on our YouTube channel and through Creation Research Live. Why not visit one of the many creation research museums around the globe? Find out more at creationresearch.net. Support creation research through tax-deductible giving in many countries. Find out more at creationresearch.net. Be sure to sign up to the Creation Evidence News. Regular updates and news from the world of creation research, science, and the latest evidence for creation.